A sheriff believed his son died in flames 7 years ago, until a mysterious maid appeared at his door with a boy who had his exact grey eyes and wore a medallion only he recognized. But who is this woman really? What secret has she been hiding? And why did she travel so far to bring him the child he never knew survived? If you're ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, love, and second chances, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more incredible stories and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love connecting with my amazing viewers from around the globe. Now, let's dive into this emotional journey that will leave you breathless. The dust settled on everything in Millbrook like grief, thick, persistent, transforming the familiar into something distant and untouchable. Elena pressed her palm against the wooden door of the sheriff's house, feeling the grain beneath her. Fingers speak of years weathered by prairie winds and unspoken sorrows. Each ridge and valley in the wood told its own story of seasons endured, of storms weathered, of time passing with the relentless patience of nature itself. The weight of her traveling bag pulled at her shoulder, but heavier still was the small hand tucked into hers, warm and trusting. 7 years of running, of careful movements from town to town, of creating new identities like a spider spinning webs, had led to this moment, this doorstep, this man inside whose name she had carried in her mind like a talisman against the darkness. "Mama." The boy's voice was barely a whisper, carried away by the evening breeze that swept across the vast expanse of grassland surrounding the modest dwelling. Thomas, not his birth name but the one that had protected him through their nomadic years, pressed closer to her side, his free hand unconsciously seeking the familiar weight of the medallion beneath his shirt. She squeezed his fingers gently, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom, or perhaps for the safety of its cage. Through the lace curtains that hung like gossamer barriers between their world and his, she could see the silhouette of a man, broad shoulders bent over papers, lamplight catching the silver threading through his dark hair like moonlight on water. Sheriff Marcus Reed, the man whose name she had carried in her mind for 7 years, whose image she had pieced together from fragments of memory and careful inquiry, from whispered conversations with strangers and half-remembered descriptions from a dying woman's lips. The boy shifted beside her, his other hand unconsciously reaching for the leather cord around his neck, fingers finding the small medallion that rested against his chest like a secret waiting to be told. Elena's breath caught in her throat, sharp as winter air. Even in the fading light, she could see how the gesture mirrored something deep and instinctive, a habit that spoke of blood and inheritance, of connections that transcended knowledge and understanding. The medallion had been with Thomas from the beginning, pressed into Elena's trembling hands along with the baby, during those terrible moments when the world had burned around them. She had never known its significance, had assumed it was merely a token, a keepsake, but now, standing before this door, watching the man inside who sat with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed and respected, she wondered if she was about to unlock a mystery that had shaped their lives from that first breath the boy had taken. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around the house, carrying with it the scent of wild sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the growing darkness, a night bird called, its voice lonely and haunting. Elena felt the weight of the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical miles covered in dusty stagecoaches and on foot, but the emotional distance traveled from that night of fire and screaming to this moment of possibility. She knocked, 3 soft taps that seemed to echo through her bones and into the very foundation of the house. The sound was simultaneously insignificant and earth-shaking, the gentle percussion that would either open the door to the truth or seal it forever. The interview had been brief, conducted in the sparse front room where shadows gathered in corners like secrets waiting to be whispered. The room spoke of a man who lived alone by choice rather than circumstance, everything arranged with military precision, yet lacking the warmth that came from shared meals and comfortable arguments and the small accumulations of a life lived with others. Sheriff Reed's eyes, grey as storm clouds gathering on the horizon, had passed over her references with practiced efficiency, scanning the carefully crafted documents that told only part of Elena's story. She had learned long ago how to present a respectable front, how to create the impression of reliability and competence while keeping the dangerous truths buried deep. But she had felt the weight of his attention differently when he looked at the boy, a quality of focus that made her pulse quicken with equal parts hope and terror. Thomas stood beside her chair, one small hand resting on her knee with the casual intimacy of a child who had never known abandonment, his dark hair catching the lamplight in ways that made her chest tighten with protective love and growing dread. The resemblance was there, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The shape of the jaw, the way his eyebrows drew together when he concentrated, the particular shade of grey in his eyes that seemed to reflect depths beyond his years. She watched the sheriff's face for recognition, for the moment when the resemblance would strike him like lightning illuminating a darkened landscape, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Years of law enforcement had taught him to observe without revealing, to gather information while presenting an unreadable facade. Eleanor wondered what he saw when he looked at Thomas, whether he felt the same inexplicable pull she had witnessed in other men when confronted with their own features, reflected in unexpected places. "Mrs. Santos," he said finally, setting down her papers with deliberate care. The formality of the address wrapped around her like armor, creating distance, even as they sat only feet apart. She had chosen the name carefully. Spanish enough to explain Thomas's olive complexion, common enough to avoid excessive curiosity, married enough to provide respectability while explaining the absence of a husband through the universal tragedy of early widowhood. "The position is simple," he continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being listened to without question. "Housekeeping, some cooking. The pay is modest but steady. Room and board included, of course." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The practical arrangements seemed almost surreal when measured against the magnitude of what this moment represented. 7 years of searching, of careful questions and patient investigation, of following rumors and half-remembered names, all leading to this conversation about laundry and meal preparation. "I understand." Her voice emerged steadier than she had expected, years of practice in hiding tremors serving her well. She had learned to present only the surface while keeping the depths undisturbed, to smile and nod, and perform the role of respectable widow seeking honest work while her heart raced with secrets that could destroy everything she had built. His gaze shifted to Thomas again, lingering on the boy's face with an intensity that made Elena's pulse quicken. There was something in his expression, not quite recognition, but a kind of stirring, as if some deeply buried instinct was beginning to wake. Thomas, unconscious of the scrutiny, studied the room with the frank curiosity of childhood, his eyes taking in the sparse decorations, the neat stacks of papers, the rifle mounted above the fireplace with its promise of protection and authority. "Your son?" The sheriff's question carried casual weight, the kind of inquiry that seemed simple, but could reshape entire lives depending on the answer. "Yes." The word carried the weight of truth and deception intertwined, heavy as river stones. It was true in every way that mattered. She had raised him, loved him, protected him, shaped his understanding of the world and his place in it. But it was also a lie that had protected them both, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with walking the razor's edge between safety and discovery. Thomas looked up at the sheriff with eyes that held depths too old for his 7 years, eyes that mirrored the storm grey of the man before him with startling precision. Elena held her breath, waiting for the inevitable recognition, for the moment, when the pieces would fall into place and their carefully constructed life would crumble. But Sheriff Reed simply nodded, his expression thoughtful but not suspicious. "He can help with small tasks," the sheriff said, his tone suggesting this was more courtesy than requirement. "School starts next month. Miss Patterson is the teacher." "Good. Woman fair but firm. Thomas will do well there, I think." The casual assumption of their permanence sent a flutter of something dangerous through Elena's chest. Hope, perhaps, or the terrifying possibility of belonging somewhere. Thomas straightened at the mention of school, his face brightening with the eager anticipation of a child who had been educated in fragments, in whatever moments of stability their wandering life had provided. The transaction felt both monumental and terrifyingly ordinary. Words exchanged, terms agreed upon. A new chapter beginning with the quiet turning of a page. Elena signed the simple agreement with a hand that barely trembled, watching the ink dry on paper that formalized their presence in Sheriff Reed's life. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to settle into the small room off the kitchen that would serve as their quarters, she wondered if she was making the greatest mistake of her life, or finally fulfilling a destiny that had been written in fire and sealed with a dying woman's desperate plea. Elena moved through the sheriff's house like water finding its course, learning the geography of his solitude with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on reading the unspoken rules that governed a space. The room spoke of a man who had pared his life down to essentials, clean surfaces that reflected lamplight with austere beauty, minimal decoration that suggested either ascetic choice or the gradual abandonment of hope for domestic warmth. Everything in its place, yet somehow hollow, as if the space itself held its breath. Each room told its own story of careful emptiness. The parlor contained only the necessary furniture arranged with mathematical precision, a single chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, a small table bearing nothing but a neat stack of books whose worn spines suggested frequent reading. The bedroom she glimpsed while cleaning held a narrow bed made with military corners, a chest of drawers whose surfaces held only the basic necessities of masculine grooming, and a window that looked out over the endless prairie with its promise of escape or entrapment, depending on one's perspective. Thomas explored with the careful curiosity of a child, accustomed to treading lightly in spaces that belonged to others. He traced his fingers along the windowsills with the reverent touch of someone who had learned to appreciate stability, studied the sparse bookshelves with the hunger of a mind eager for stories, sat cross-legged on the floor to examine the patterns in the worn rug, as if they might reveal secrets about the man who had chosen this particular design years ago, when hope for companionship might have still colored his decisions. Elena watched him navigate this new territory, seeing how he unconsciously adopted the sheriff's measured movements, his quiet way of occupying space without demanding attention or approval. The boy had learned early to make himself small when necessary to observe and adapt and find his place in whatever environment their circumstances required. It broke her heart even as it filled her with pride, this resilience that should have been unnecessary, this premature wisdom that spoke of too many temporary homes and too many careful exits. In the kitchen, she discovered the sheriff's habits, through evidence left behind like archaeological clues to a solitary existence. Coffee grounds pressed into precise rows spoke of morning rituals performed with mechanical regularity. Dishes washed and dried with methodical care suggested a man who had learned to find peace in small acts of order, perhaps the only control available in a life dedicated to enforcing law in a land where chaos often reigned supreme. A single place setting on the wooden table spoke of meals taken in solitude, of conversations limited to the voices in his head or the occasional visitor who shared coffee but never dinner. She began to weave herself into this routine with the delicate precision of someone adding threads to an existing pattern without disrupting its fundamental structure. Preparing breakfast before he woke, leaving his coffee exactly as she found the remnants suggested he preferred it, strong enough to chase away the lingering shadows of whatever dreams visited Lawman in the small hours of the night. Adding small touches that spoke of care without presumption, wildflowers from the prairie arranged in mason jars, bread baked fresh and left cooling on the counter like an offering to domestic gods that had long since abandoned this house. The medallion around Thomas's neck caught the morning light as he helped her fold laundry, the silver star reflecting brightness in patterns that danced across the kitchen walls like captured starlight. Eleanor's hands stilled on the sheriff's shirt, white cotton worn soft by use, smelling faintly of soap and saddle leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her chest tighten with awareness she had no right to feel. The leather cord was old, worn soft by years of wear against young skin, and the medallion itself seemed to pulse with significance she couldn't name. She had found it among the babies swaddling that terrible night, assumed it was some childhood treasure or religious token. Now in this house filled with the sheriff's careful emptiness, surrounded by the artifacts of a life lived in service to others, while maintaining emotional distance from everyone, It felt like a key to doors she wasn't sure she was ready to open. Sometimes she caught Sheriff Reed watching Thomas with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not suspicious exactly, but searching, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. The boy, unconscious of this scrutiny, went about his days with the cheerful adaptability that had carried him through 7 years of uncertainty, helping with small chores and exploring the boundaries of their new world with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had learned that understanding one's environment was essential to survival. The first true conversation came on a Tuesday morning, unexpected as rain in drought season. Sheriff Reed had lingered over his coffee, watching Thomas help Elena arrange wildflowers in a mason jar, purple prairie blooms that Thomas had gathered from the field behind the house, with the selective eye of someone who understood the difference between flowers that would bring joy and those that would only wither and disappoint. The domestic scene seemed to capture something in the sheriff's attention, drawing his focus from the stack of legal documents that usually commanded his morning hours. Elena felt his gaze like a physical weight, warm and searching, as she guided Thomas's small hands in creating an arrangement that would bring color to the austere kitchen without overwhelming its careful simplicity. "He has good instincts," the sheriff said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone Elena couldn't decipher, but that resonated through her bones like the memory of thunder. "Knows which flowers will last, which ones fade quickly." The observation was casual, seemingly innocent, but it carried implications that made Elena's breath catch. How could he know about Thomas's particular gifts unless he shared them himself? The boy had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense the life force in growing things, to choose the blossoms that would survive transplanting and thrive in new environments, while avoiding those that were already beginning their journey toward darkness. Thomas looked up from his careful arrangement, his small face serious with concentration, unconsciously mimicking an expression Eleanor had seen flash across the sheriff's features during moments of deep thought. "My mama taught me," he said simply, then glanced at Elena with trust so complete it made her throat tight with emotion. She had no right to feel in this moment of casual revelation. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meanings that shifted like shadows at sunset. Elena knew Thomas was speaking of her, the only mother he remembered. But the sheriff's eyes sharpened with interest that suggested he might be thinking of another woman entirely, someone whose knowledge of growing things had been passed down through blood rather than teaching. The sheriff's grey eyes moved between them, searching for something Elena feared he might find. She forced herself to breathe normally, to maintain the careful composure that had protected them through 7 years of running, but she could feel the weight of his attention like pressure against her skin. "Where did you come from before here?" The question emerged with deceptive casualness, the kind of inquiry that seemed natural in the flow of conversation, but carried the potential to unravel everything they had built. The question hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight, each particle visible and distinct, impossible to ignore. Elena felt the weight of 7 years, of careful decisions and sleepless nights, of a truth too complex for simple telling. How could she explain the maze of half-truths and careful omissions that had brought them to this kitchen, this moment, this man whose very presence seemed to call to something deep in Thomas's bones? "East," she answered, which was not a lie but far from the whole truth. The word carried the weight of miles and memory, of a journey that had been less about geographical distance than about the space between one life and another, between the woman she had been in service to the Brennan family and the woman she had become in her fierce dedication to protecting a child who had arrived in her arms through tragedy. "We traveled a long time to get here," she continued, watching Thomas nod solemnly in confirmation of this carefully edited version of their story. Thomas straightened with the importance of being included in adult conversation. "Mama said we were looking for something important." Eleanor's breath caught, but Sheriff Reed simply reached across the table and straightened one of the flowers in the jar, a gesture so gentle it seemed to surprise him, his large hands moving with unexpected delicacy among the fragile blooms. His fingers brushed Thomas's for just a moment, and Elena saw something shift in his expression, like clouds moving across the sun, revealing glimpses of light that had been hidden behind layers of careful control. "Sometimes the important things are closer than we think," he said, and Elena wondered if he was speaking to Thomas or to himself, if the words carried meanings that reached beyond this conversation into territories of understanding that none of them were quite ready to explore. The moment stretched between them, filled with the kind of significance that transforms ordinary interactions into something approaching revelation. Elena felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, able to see vast distances, but uncertain whether the next step would lead to solid ground or endless falling. It happened on a Thursday, while Elena was mending one of the sheriff's shirts in the afternoon light that slanted through the parlor window like golden honey, warming the modest room and casting everything in the kind of gentle illumination that made even ordinary objects seem touched with significance. The shirt was well made but showing wear, a small tear in the sleeve that spoke of active days spent in service to a community that depended on his presence and authority. Thomas sat nearby, working at his letters on a piece of slate with the concentrated effort of a child, determined to master skills that would serve him well in the world he was growing into. His tongue caught between his lips in concentration, a habit that Elena had always found endearing, but which now seemed to carry additional weight as she noticed how it mirrored similar expressions she had glimpsed on the sheriff's face during moments of deep focus. The medallion had slipped free from his shirt and caught the light as he bent over his work, the silver star reflecting afternoon sunshine in patterns that danced across the slate surface and drew the eye like a beacon. It was such a small thing, this piece of jewelry that had traveled with them through 7 years of careful movement, but Elena had learned that small things often carried the greatest significance, a lesson born from years of reading situations and people for the subtle signs that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Sheriff Reed paused in the doorway, returning from his afternoon rounds through the town, and Eleanor watched his face transform with the slow inevitability of sunrise changing the landscape from shadow to revelation. The careful neutrality that he wore like armor in his professional life dissolved, replaced by something raw and unguarded, recognition, disbelief, a grief so deep it seemed to reshape his features and reveal the man beneath the badge. His eyes fixed on the medallion with an intensity that made Elena's hands still on the fabric, her needle suspended between stitches as if time itself had paused to allow this moment its full weight. She knew that look, had seen it in her own mirror too many times during the early years, when unexpected reminders would surface to pierce the careful walls she had built around her memories. The expression of someone confronting a ghost, Maid. Flesh, a piece of the past that had been presumed lost forever. Where? His voice cracked like ice under pressure, and he cleared his throat with the harsh sound of a man struggling to maintain composure in the face of impossibility. Where did he get that? The question emerged from somewhere deeper than curiosity, carrying undertones of desperate hope and barely contained emotion that suggested this simple piece of jewelry represented something far more significant than its modest appearance would suggest. Elena felt the careful architecture of their secret beginning to tremble under the weight of this moment. Thomas looked up innocently, his hand moving automatically to cover the medallion with the protective instinct of a child who had learned that treasures were precious partly because they could be lost. "It's mine," he said simply, his voice carrying the unassailable logic of childhood ownership. "I've always had it." The words struck Sheriff Reed like physical blows, each syllable seeming to resonate through his entire body. Elena watched him struggle with some internal battle, seeing the lawman's training war with emotional response, professional skepticism fighting against hope too dangerous to fully acknowledge. Elena set down her mending with hands that trembled. Despite her efforts to remain steady, the sheriff's shirt falling into her lap like a white flag of surrender. The moment she had dreaded and anticipated for 7 years stretched between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, and she knew that whatever happened next would irrevocably alter the careful balance they had achieved in this house. Sheriff Reed stepped into the room, his movements careful as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at the first sign of threat. His eyes never left the medallion, drinking in details with the hungry attention of someone confirming the reality of a miracle or perhaps a nightmare. "May I see it?" he asked, his voice gentler than Eleanor had ever heard it, stripped of authority and reduced to simple human need. Thomas looked to Eleanor, seeking permission with eyes that held too much trust, too much faith in her ability to navigate situations that were rapidly moving beyond her control. She nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs like wings against glass, like something wild and desperate trying to escape the cage of her careful composure. The boy lifted the cord over his head with solemn gravity, understanding instinctively that this moment carried weight beyond his comprehension, but trusting in the safety that Elena had always provided. He handed the medallion to the sheriff. With the careful ceremony of someone passing on something precious and irreplaceable, Elena watched Sheriff Reed's face as he turned the silver star over in his palm, his thumb tracing the engraved surface with intimate familiarity that spoke of countless previous handlings, of memories associated with every scratch and tarnish, mark on the metal surface. His hands shook slightly, betraying the emotional impact that his carefully controlled expression tried to hide. "This was made by the smithy in Colton," he said quietly, his voice thick with memory and growing certainty. "Special order. Only one like it ever made." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with them the scent of truth and consequence. Eleanor felt the careful architecture of her secret beginning to crumble, each word from the sheriff's lips removing another stone from the foundation of the life she had built through 7 years of careful deception and desperate love. The atmosphere in the house shifted after that afternoon, charged with unspoken questions and careful observations, like the air before a thunderstorm, when even the birds grow quiet in anticipation of the violence to come. Elena moved through her duties with heightened awareness, conscious of every glance Sheriff Reed directed toward Thomas, every pause in conversation that seemed weighted with significance, every moment of silence that stretched just a beat too long and carried implications she wasn't ready to confront. The change was subtle but pervasive, affecting the rhythm of their days in ways both large and small. Where before Sheriff Reed had been courteous but distant, maintaining the professional boundaries appropriate between employer and employee, now she caught him watching Thomas with an intensity that made her breath catch and her hands tremble as she went about the ordinary tasks of keeping house. The boy himself remained unchanged, his natural ease with the sheriff deepening into something that looked startlingly like kinship. He began trailing after the man in the evenings, helping with small tasks around the property, listening to stories of the town's history with rapt attention that seemed to hunger for details about the place they now called home. Eleanor watched, these interactions with a mixture of joy and terror, seeing in Thomas's face an expression of belonging she had never been able to give him, no matter how much love she poured into their small family of 2. There were moments when the resemblance between them was so striking it took her breath away. The way they both frowned when concentrating, the identical gesture of running fingers through dark hair when puzzled, the shared habit of standing, with hands clasped behind their backs, when surveying their domain. These echoes of inherited behavior seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing day, as if proximity were awakening dormant connections that had been waiting 7 years to be recognized. On Sunday, Sheriff Reed didn't attend church, as was his custom, a break in routine that set the town's gossips buzzing with speculation about everything from illness to religious crisis. Instead, he sat on the front porch with Thomas, teaching him to whittle a piece of pine with the patient dedication of someone passing down knowledge that mattered beyond the simple act of shaping wood. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as the man's large hands guided the boy's smaller ones, showing him how to follow the grain of the wood, how to make each cut count, how to transform raw material into something useful and beautiful through patience and skill. The lessons seemed to encompass more than woodworking. She could see in the sheriff's careful attention the desire to impart wisdom, to share the accumulated knowledge of years spent understanding how things worked and how they could be improved. "Like this, sir?" Thomas asked, holding up his work for inspection with the eager hope of a child seeking approval from someone whose opinion had rapidly become important to him. Just like that. The sheriff's voice carried a warmth Eleanor had never heard before, a tenderness that transformed his usually austere features and revealed glimpses of the man he might have been in different circumstances. "You have natural hands for it." The medallion caught the morning light as Thomas bent back to his work, and Elena saw the sheriff's eyes linger on it with an expression of profound longing that made her chest tight with sympathy and growing dread. The piece of jewelry had become a bridge between past and present, a tangible connection to mysteries that were demanding to be solved. Mrs. Henderson from down the road chose that moment to walk past, her sharp eyes taking in the domestic scene with obvious interest and barely concealed calculation. Helena watched the woman's gaze move from the sheriff to Thomas, noting the resemblance that seemed to grow more pronounced each day, cataloguing details that would later be dissected and discussed in the privacy of neighbors' parlors and church vestibules. The weight of small-town scrutiny settled over Helena like a shroud, heavy with judgment and speculation. She knew how quickly rumors could spread in a place like Millbrook, how innocent observations could be transformed into scandalous assumptions, how the careful life she had built could be destroyed by whispers and pointed fingers and the relentless curiosity of people who had too little excitement in their own lives. Mrs. Henderson paused at the gate, her smile sharp as winter wind as she called out a greeting that carried undertones of interrogation disguised as neighborly interest. Helena forced herself to return the woman's wave, while calculating the best way to deflect questions that were surely coming, knowing that their careful balance was becoming increasingly unsustainable with each passing day. The truth began to emerge in pieces, like a photograph developing in solution, slowly revealing details that had been there all along, but invisible until the proper conditions brought them into focus. Eleanor found herself sharing fragments of memory almost against her will, Thomas's love of horses, that seemed to exist in his very bones, his fear of thunder that could only be soothed by being held close and sung to, the way he hummed tunelessly when he was content, creating melodies that seemed to come from some deep well of inherited music. Each detail seemed to resonate with Sheriff Reed in ways that made his expression tighten with recognition and loss, as if her casual observations were pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve without knowing he was missing crucial elements. She began to understand that these weren't simply the quirks and preferences of childhood, but echoes of deeper connections that linked Thomas to a heritage he had never consciously known. The sharing happened gradually, emerging during the quiet moments that punctuated their days, while preparing meals, while Thomas played in the garden, while the sheriff lingered over his evening coffee, as if reluctant to end the day and return to the solitude of his thoughts. Helena found herself revealing more than she had intended, drawn into conversations that felt simultaneously dangerous and necessary. "He was born in April," Helena found herself saying one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, with joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the air around him. "During the big storm, I remember because the wind was so fierce it sounded like the world was ending." The words emerged without conscious decision, pulled from her by the peaceful domesticity of the moment and the way the sheriff's presence had begun to feel less like that of an employer and more like something approaching family. She hadn't meant to reveal this particular detail, but the memory had been stirred by the approaching weather, clouds gathering on the horizon with the promise of rain and the kind of wind that could reshape the landscape in a single night. Sheriff Reed's hands stilled on the coffee cup he held, his knuckles going white with the force of his grip. 7 years ago? Yes, the word emerged as barely a whisper, carrying with it the weight of all the moments that had led from that night of chaos and tragedy to this evening of tentative peace. The silence stretched between them, filled with implications neither was ready to voice. In the distance, Thomas's laughter rang out clear and bright, untouched by the weight of adult complications and the secrets that shaped his existence without his knowledge. The sound seemed to anchor them both to the present moment, even as the past pressed against the boundaries of their carefully maintained composure. "His mother," Sheriff Reed said carefully, his voice carrying the controlled tone of someone walking through a minefield of emotional hazards. "Where is she?" Elena's throat constricted with the familiar tightness that came whenever she approached the dangerous territory of Thomas's origins. The careful story she had constructed, widowed young, traveling west for work, felt suddenly fragile as spun glass, inadequate to bear the weight of truth that was pressing against it with increasing insistence. "She died when he was very small," Elena said, the words carrying truth even as they concealed the full complexity of the situation. He doesn't remember her. It wasn't entirely a lie. The woman who had given birth to Thomas, who had pressed the medallion into Elena's hands with desperate urgency while the world burned around them, had died in the chaos of that terrible night. But the full truth was so much more complex, tangled with fear and flight, with desperate choices made in the shadow of flames and the weight of responsibility for a life that had been thrust into her arms by circumstance and tragedy. Sheriff. Reed nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Thomas's small figure dancing among the lightning bugs with the unself-conscious grace of childhood innocence. She must have been very young. Too young, Elena agreed, and felt the weight of that. Truth settled in her chest like a stone. Mary Brennan had been barely more than a child herself when she died, her life cut short by circumstances beyond her control and choices that had seemed impossible at the time, but had led inevitably to that night of fire and loss. The conversation continued in fragments over the following days and weeks, pieces of information emerging like debris washing ashore after a shipwreck. Elena found herself revealing Thomas's particular habits and preferences, the small details that painted a picture of a child who carried within him echoes of someone he had never known. She spoke of his instinctive way with animals, how horses calmed in his presence, and dogs followed him with devoted eyes. She mentioned his love of storms despite his fear of them, the way he would stand at windows during thunderstorms with a mixture of terror and fascination that suggested deep recognition of something powerful and uncontrollable. She shared his habit of arranging small objects in precise patterns when he was thinking, creating order from chaos with the unconscious skill of someone who understood the importance of bringing structure to a world that often seemed determined to remain wild. Each revelation seemed to strike Sheriff Reed with increasing force, as if Elena were providing pieces to a puzzle he had been carrying incomplete for 7 years. She began to understand that these weren't simply interesting observations about a child's development, but confirmations of connections that ran deeper than coincidence or wishful thinking. Sunday dinner had become a ritual that Elena treasured even as it terrified her, a pocket of domesticity that felt both natural and impossibly fragile, as if the wrong word or gesture might shatter it like glass struck by lightning. The 3 of them gathered around the small kitchen table, transformed by Elena's care into something approaching a family dining room with wildflowers from the prairie and careful attention to the small details that made meals feel like celebrations rather than mere sustenance. Sheriff Reed carved the roast with steady hands that spoke of years of practice in wielding tools with precision and purpose, while Thomas regaled them with stories from his explorations of the town, his animated gestures and bright chatter filling the dining room with warmth it hadn't known in years. Elena listened to his observations about the people he had met and the places he had discovered, marveling at how quickly he had begun to put down roots in soil that she still feared might prove too rocky to support their growing hopes. The boy had discovered the blacksmith's shop and spent hours watching the man work iron into useful shapes, fascinated by the transformation of raw metal into horseshoes and tools and decorative pieces that would serve the community for years to come. He had befriended the pastor's wife, who had taught him to identify different varieties of birds by their songs and their flight patterns. He had earned the grudging respect of the other children by demonstrating his skill at fishing in the creek that wound through the town like a silver ribbon, connecting past and future. Pastor Williams asked about Thomas, Sheriff Reed said casually, serving Elena a portion of meat with the careful attention to her preferences that he had developed over their weeks of shared meals. Wants to know about his schooling, his background. Elena's fork paused midway to her mouth, the bite of perfectly seasoned beef suddenly tasteless as dust in her mouth. The pastor's interest felt loaded with implications, another thread in the web of small-town curiosity that seemed to tighten around them daily. She had known this moment would come, the inevitable questions about documentation and history that would be required for Thomas to attend school and become truly part of the community. "I told him you were from back east," the sheriff continued. His tone, carefully neutral in the way that Elena had learned, meant he was paying closer attention than his casual manner suggested. "That you'd traveled a long way." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Elena wondered if He was beginning to understand that their journey had been about more than geographical distance. She had been careful in her answers to his gentle probing, but she suspected that a man trained in law enforcement would eventually begin to notice the gaps in her stories, the places where her carefully constructed history failed to align with the reality of their circumstances. Thomas looked up from his plate, his expression suddenly serious with the kind of gravity that could descend on children when they sensed that adult conversations carried implications for their security and future. "Are we staying here, Mama, or do we have to keep moving?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, weighted with hope and fear in equal measure. Eleanor felt Sheriff Reed's eyes on her, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she could give without revealing more than she was ready to share. The boy's innocent inquiry had laid bare the fundamental uncertainty that still governed their lives, despite the growing sense of belonging that had developed over their weeks in the sheriff's house. "I don't know," she said honestly, unable to offer false assurances when so much still hung in the balance. "Would you like to stay?" Thomas nodded vigorously, his entire face lighting up with enthusiasm that made Elena's chest tight with love and protective fear. "I like it here. I like Sheriff Reed. He knows things about horses and wood carving and—" He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to the medallion at his throat. "He makes me feel safe." Elena's breath caught at the simple honesty of it, at the way Thomas had articulated something she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. The boy had never known the security of a stable home or the protection of a father figure, and watching him blossom under the sheriff's quiet attention had awakened longings in Elena that she had thought safely buried beneath years of practical necessity. Across the table, Sheriff Reed's face had gone very still, his grey eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and reveal the raw emotion beneath his carefully maintained composure. Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that went beyond the physical resemblance that had been growing more obvious with each passing day. "Thomas," he said quietly, his voice gentler than Elena had ever heard it. "Do you remember anything from before you came to live with Eleanor?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning years of carefully maintained secrets, and Elena felt her heart stop as she waited for Thomas's response. The boy frowned in concentration, his young brow furrowing with effort as he reached into memories that were largely composed of feelings and impressions rather than clear images. "Sometimes I dream about fire," he said slowly, his voice taking on the distant quality that children used when discussing things that existed at the edges of their understanding. "And smoke, and a woman crying. But Elena says dreams aren't always real." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of truth demanding to be told. She had taught Thomas to dismiss those fragments of memory as imagination, hoping to protect him from the trauma of his earliest experiences. But now she wondered if she had been protecting herself as much as the boy. Sheriff Reed's eyes moved, from Thomas to Elena, and she saw in them a growing understanding that made her feel simultaneously relieved and terrified. The moment of revelation was approaching with the inevitability of sunrise, and she knew that all her careful planning and patient deception were about to be swept away by forces too powerful to resist. Monday brought Mrs. Henderson to the front door, armed with a covered dish and pointed curiosity that glittered in her small, sharp eyes like sunlight on broken glass. Eleanor invited her in out of politeness, but regretted it immediately as the woman's calculating gaze catalogued every detail of the room, Thomas's drawings scattered across the kitchen table with the careless abundance of childhood creativity, his small jacket hanging by the door next to the sheriff's larger coat in a display of domestic intimacy that would not go unnoticed, the easy familiarity that had developed between the boy and every corner of what was supposed to be a temporary workplace. "Such a fine boy," Mrs. Henderson said, settling her considerable bulk into Sheriff Reed's favorite chair with proprietary ease that suggested she considered herself entitled to make herself at home in any house in town. Her voice carried the saccharine sweetness that Elena had learned to recognize as barely concealed malice, the tone of someone who delivered poison wrapped in the guise of compliments. "Looks so much like his father, don't you think?" Elena's blood chilled, the words striking her like physical blows even though she had been expecting something of the sort. The woman's smile was predatory, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for ordinary conversation, and her eyes held the gleam of someone who had discovered a secret and intended to use it for maximum effect. "I'm sorry," Elena managed, though her voice sounded distant and strange to her own ears. "Oh, come now, dear." The woman's smile widened, revealing more of those predatory teeth. Anyone with eyes can see the resemblance. Those grey eyes, the way he holds his head when he's thinking. Spitting image of our sheriff he is. Thomas playing quietly in the corner with wooden blocks that Sheriff Reed had carved for him during the long evenings when the three of them had sat together in comfortable domesticity, looked up at the mention of his name. Elena watched Mrs. Henderson's gaze move between the boy and the photographs on the mantelpiece, images of Sheriff Reed in his younger days that Elena had studied countless times, seeing in them the echo of Thomas's features growing stronger with each day that passed. The resemblance was there, undeniable now that someone had spoken it aloud with such calculated cruelty. The shape of the jaw that was beginning to emerge as Thomas lost the softness of early childhood, the particular way his eyebrows drew together when he concentrated, the exact shade of grey in his eyes that seemed to reflect depths beyond his years, all of it pointed to connections that Elena had hoped might remain unnoticed for a little longer. "People are talking," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow managed to carry more menace than a shout. "Wondering where you really came from, why you'd travel so far with just a boy. Some say you must be running from something." Elena forced her voice to remain steady, calling on years of practice in presenting a calm facade, while chaos raged beneath the surface. "People will always talk." "Indeed they will." The woman's eyes glittered with malicious interest, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was savoring the moment before the final strike. Especially when mysterious women appear with children who look remarkably like prominent citizens, makes folks wonder what secrets might be hiding behind respectable facades. The threat was clear, wrapped in the guise of neighborly concern, but sharp as a blade held to the throat. Elena felt the walls of their carefully constructed new life pressing in around her, the weight of judgment and suspicion threatening to crush the fragile peace they had found in the sheriff's house and in the growing affection that had developed between the three of them. Mrs. Henderson rose from her chair with theatrical reluctance, as if she regretted having to end such a pleasant conversation. "Well, I should be going. Thank you for the lovely visit, dear. And do give my regards to the sheriff. Such a good man, devoted to his duty. I'm sure he'd want to know if there were anything irregular happening in his own household." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire as the woman made her way to the door, her exit as calculated as her entrance had been. Eleanor stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to the sound of footsteps retreating down the path, knowing that Mrs. Henderson was already composing the version of this conversation that she would share with her network of gossips and busybodies. After the woman left, Elena sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, feeling the inevitability of revelation bearing down on her like a storm front moving across the prairie with unstoppable force. The choice was being taken from her piece by piece, extracted by sharp tongues and sharper eyes, and she wondered if she had ever really had control at all, or if she had simply been moving through the steps of a dance whose ending had been determined. From the moment she had first knocked on the sheriff's door, Thomas approached her quietly, his small hand coming to rest on her shoulder with the comforting instinct of a child who had learned to recognize distress even when adults tried to hide it. "Mama, are you sad?" Eleanor looked up into his grey eyes, eyes that were undeniably his father's, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. The time for secrets was ending, and she could only hope that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be gentle enough to preserve the love that had grown between them all. Sheriff Reed came home that evening with tension written in every line of his body, the controlled anger of a man who had spent his day fielding questions and insinuations that he was not yet prepared to address. Elena heard it in the way he closed the door, not quite a slam but firm enough to speak of frustration held in check by years of professional discipline. The sound echoed through the house like thunder preceding a storm, and she knew that the careful balance they had maintained was about to be shattered. She was preparing dinner when he entered the kitchen, his grey eyes stormy with emotion that he was struggling to contain. The day's heat clung to him like dust, and she could see the weariness in his shoulders that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. This was the fatigue that came from fighting battles on multiple fronts, from maintaining composure in the face of speculation and whispered accusations that struck too close to truths he was only beginning to understand. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing toward the parlor where Thomas was reading one of the books from the sheriff's sparse collection, his small form curled in the chair that had become his favorite spot for losing himself in stories of adventure and heroism. Eleanor's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping, the knife suddenly feeling heavy and dangerous in her grip. The moment she had dreaded for months had arrived with the inexorability of winter, and she could see, in the sheriff's face, that he had reached the limits of his patience with half-truths and careful omissions. They stepped onto the back porch, where the evening air carried the scent of prairie grass and distant rain, the kind of weather that promised cleansing but delivered it through violence and upheaval. Sheriff Reed leaned against the railing, his profile sharp against the darkening sky, and Elena could see the tension in his jaw that spoke of words held back by effort rather than ease. "Doc Morrison was in town today," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled tone of a man delivering facts rather than accusations. "Mentioned he delivered a baby 7 years ago, during the big storm. Said it was unusual. The mother was young, unmarried. She died shortly after." Eleanor's chest tightened, each word striking her like stones thrown with careful aim. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but the reality of it was more devastating than she had imagined. All their careful peace, all the domestic harmony they had built over weeks of shared meals and growing affection, was about to be swept away by truths that demanded acknowledgement. "There were probably many births that year," she said weakly, knowing even as she spoke that the words were inadequate to deflect the growing certainty in his voice. "Not with complications like that," Sheriff Reed continued, his tone growing more definite with each word. "Not where the baby disappeared the same night as the fire at the Brennan place." His voice was carefully controlled, but Elena could hear the tremor beneath the surface, the emotion that was threatening to break through years of professional composure, where outlaws were said to have taken hostages. The words hung between them like a bridge spanning years of silence, connecting the tragedy of that distant night to this moment of reckoning. Elena gripped the porch railing, feeling the wood grain bite into her palms, anchoring herself to the physical reality of the present moment, even as the past rose up to claim its due. She could see it all again, the flames that had turned night into day, the screaming that had torn through, the air like the cries of damned souls, the chaos that had provided cover for desperate actions and impossible choices. Mary Brennan pressing the baby into her arms, with hands that shook with more than fear, begging her to save what could be saved from the destruction that was consuming everything they had known. Elena. Her name on his lips was both question and accusation, carrying the weight of all the moments they had shared since she had first appeared at his door with Thomas at her side. Who is Thomas? The simple question carried the weight of 7 years, of sleepless nights and difficult choices, of love born from desperation and nurtured in secrecy. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the last of her defenses crumble under the pressure of truth that could no longer be contained. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of night insects and distant thunder, nature providing a soundtrack for human drama that was about to reshape their understanding. Ferv everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. "He's yours," she whispered, the words barely audible above the evening wind but carrying more force than any shout could have achieved. "Thomas is your son." The silence that followed Eleanor's confession seemed to stretch across eternity, each second expanding to contain lifetimes of possibility and regret. Sheriff Reed's hands gripped the porch railing so tightly his knuckles went white, his body rigid, as if struck by lightning that had left him frozen between one heartbeat and the next. "Mine." The word emerged as barely a breath, a sound so quiet it might have been the wind moving through the prairie grass, but Eleanor heard in it the echo of 7 years of unknowing loss, of grief for a child he had never known existed. Elena nodded, tears she had held back for years finally spilling over, carrying with them the salt of secrets that had burned her throat for too long. The relief of finally speaking the truth was overwhelming, even as terror at its consequences threatened to drive her to her knees. "Mary was his mother," she began, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "Mary Brennan. She was so young, so frightened. The outlaws came that night, set fire to the house. In all the chaos, in the smoke and screaming." Her voice broke, the memory still vivid enough to steal her breath. "She pressed him into my arms, begged me to keep him safe, said his father was a good man, an honorable man. She died before she could tell me more." Sheriff Reed turned to face her, his expression raw with grief and wonder, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. The careful professional mask had fallen away completely, revealing the man beneath, vulnerable, shaken, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the story she was telling. Mary Brennan. He spoke the name like a prayer, or perhaps a confession. "I remember her. Sweet girl, worked at the general store. I never knew." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture helpless and somehow heartbreaking. "I never knew she was carrying my child." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that neither had been prepared to face. Elena saw in his face the struggle to piece together fragments of memory, to understand how a brief connection had created a life that had been shaped by tragedy before it had properly begun. "She loved you," Elena said softly, wanting to offer what comfort she could in the face of revelations that must be reshaping his understanding of himself and his place in the world. "Even in those final moments, she spoke of you with such tenderness. She wanted Thomas to know he came from love, not shame." Through the kitchen window, they could see Thomas at the table, his dark head bent over his book, completely absorbed in the story before him. The sight of him, their son, Elena realized with a start that sent fresh waves of complicated emotion through her chest, seemed to anchor them both to the present moment, to the reality of a child who existed regardless of the circumstances. That had brought him into being. 7 years, Sheriff Reed said wonderingly, his voice thick with emotion that had been too long suppressed. 7 years I thought I had no family, no legacy, and all this time, I didn't know how to tell you, Elena admitted, the words rushing out in her need to make him understand the impossible position she had found herself in. I was just a servant in the Brennan house, nobody special. Who would believe me? And Thomas was so small, so vulnerable. I was afraid of what might happen if I couldn't prove his parentage. The fear had been real and constant, driving them from town to town whenever questions became too pointed or attention too focused. She had seen what happened to women who made claims without proof, to children whose legitimacy was questioned. The protection of anonymity had seemed preferable to the risk of exposure and potential separation. Sheriff Reed reached out slowly, his fingers brushing her cheek where tears still fell with the gentle touch of someone handling something precious and breakable. "You raised him. You loved him, protected him, gave him everything I couldn't. You're his mother in every way that matters." The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her completely, stripping away the last of her defenses and leaving her vulnerable to emotions she had spent years holding at bay. "I love him as if he were my own blood," she whispered, the truth of it evident in every word. "But he has a right to know his father." The statement hung between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross, representing territory neither had expected to navigate, but which now demanded their careful attention. Elena felt the weight of the moment, understanding that whatever happened next would determine not just Thomas's future, but the shape of all their lives going forward. The night passed without sleep for either of them, the house settling around them with the soft sounds of wood contracting in the cooling air while they lay wakeful in their separate rooms, processing revelations that had changed everything and, yet somehow changed nothing at all. Elena found Sheriff Reed on the front porch as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas still sleeping peacefully in his small bed upstairs, innocent of the adult complications that swirled around his existence. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion, carrying the weight of a night spent wrestling with impossible questions that had no easy answers. About what this means for all of us. Eleanor settled, beside him on the porch steps, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but careful not to presume intimacy beyond what the situation demanded. The morning air was cool against her skin, carrying promises of the day to come and the decisions that could no longer be postponed. The sunrise painted the prairie in colors that seemed too beautiful for the gravity of their circumstances, as if nature were offering beauty as compensation for human complexity. Elena watched the light spread across the grassland and wondered if they would still be here to see tomorrow's dawn, or if the truth would scatter them like seeds on the wind. "The town will have opinions," she said quietly, giving voice to the practical concerns that had kept her awake through the dark hours. "Mrs. Henderson and her ilk will make sure everyone knows the story, or their version of it." She could already imagine the whispered conversations, the pointed looks, the way their carefully constructed life would be dissected and judged by people who had never faced choices more difficult than what to serve for Sunday dinner. The thought of exposing Thomas to that scrutiny made her chest tight with protective anger. Let them talk. There was steel in his voice now, the authority that made him respected throughout the county emerging as he claimed his ground. "Thomas is my son. My blood, no one can change that." The simple declaration carried more weight than any legal document could have achieved, staking a claim that transcended social convention and community opinion. Elena felt a flutter of hope in her chest, fragile as butterfly wings, but persistent in its desire to take flight. "What are you saying?" she asked, afraid to assume too much but unable to suppress the growing sense that this conversation was moving toward territories she had never dared to hope they might explore. "Sheriff," Reed turned to face her fully, his grey eyes clear with decision that seemed to illuminate his features from within. "I'm saying we tell Thomas the truth, all of it. He deserves to know who he is, where he comes from." The words struck her like benediction, offering absolution for years of necessary deception. But even as relief flooded through her, practical questions pressed for attention. "And then?" she asked, the words barely audible above the morning breeze that stirred the grass around the house. The question hung between them, weighted with possibility and fear in equal measure. Sheriff Reed reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary, as if they were crossing a threshold that would change everything that came after. "Then we figure out what comes next, together." His thumb traced over her knuckles, gentle and sure, the touch of someone offering comfort and perhaps something more. "You've been his mother for 7 years, Elena. I won't take that from him. But if you'll have me, if you'll both have me, I'd like to be his father. Not just in blood, but in truth." Elena's breath caught, the offer so far beyond her expectations that she struggled to process its implications. "Marcus, I know it's complicated," he continued, vulnerability flickering across his features as he spoke words that must have cost him considerable effort. "I know people will talk, will judge, but Thomas needs both of us. And He paused, the admission seeming to surprise him even as he spoke it. "I need you both. You've given me back something I didn't even know. So I'd lost." The confession hung between them like sunrise itself, illuminating landscapes that had been hidden in darkness. Elena felt the rightness of it settle in her bones, like coming home after years of wandering, like finding the place where she was meant to be all along. The sun crested the horizon, bathing them in golden light that seemed to bless the moment with approval from powers greater than human judgment. Elena squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work, and the strength that had protected a community for years, now offered to protect a family that was just beginning to understand itself. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying more weight than any marriage vow. "Yes to all of it." They told Thomas over breakfast, the three of them seated around the kitchen table that had become the heart of their small family, sunlight streaming through windows that Elena had polished, until they sparkled like crystal. The ordinary moment was transformed by the weight of what was about to be shared, breakfast becoming a ceremony of revelation, that would reshape a child's understanding of himself and his place in the world. Elena watched her boy's face as Sheriff. Reed spoke gently about Mary, about love and loss, about the medallion that had traveled with him from his earliest days, like a talisman carrying the history he had never known. The Sheriff's voice was steady and warm, treating Thomas with the respect due to someone whose life was about to change forever, explaining the complex circumstances of his birth with the careful honesty that children deserved but rarely received. Thomas listened with the serious attention he gave to important things, his small hands wrapped around his cup of milk, the medallion visible at his throat, catching the morning light like a star fallen to earth. The silver seemed to pulse with significance now that its history was being revealed, transformed from simple jewelry into a bridge connecting past and present, blood and choice, love and loss. When the story ended, he was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would reshape his understanding of himself and his origins. Elena held her breath, waiting for questions or tears, or the kind of confusion that might overwhelm a child faced with such revelations. But Thomas had always possessed wisdom beyond his years, the kind of understanding that came from a life that had required early adaptation to circumstances beyond his control. "So, my mama who died gave birth to me," he said slowly, working through the logic with careful precision. "But Elena is my mama who raised me, and you're my papa who didn't know I existed until now." Sheriff Reed nodded, his voice thick with emotion that he was struggling to contain. "That's right, son." The word son hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement. It was claim and blessing combined, recognition of bonds that transcended biology to encompass choice and commitment, and the kind of love that was built through shared experience rather than inherited assumption. Thomas looked between them, his grey eyes, so like his father's, thoughtful and calm, processing not just the information he had received, but the emotional undercurrents that flowed between the adults who had shaped his world. "Does this mean we can stay here forever? All of us together?" Eleanor's heart clenched with love for this boy, who had adapted to so much change with such grace, who faced each new revelation with the resilience that had carried him through 7 years of uncertainty. "If that's what you want." "It is." Thomas reached across the table, taking both their hands in his small ones with the kind of gesture that seemed to carry ceremonial weight. "I always wanted a real family. I just didn't know I already had one." The simple acceptance in his voice broke something open in Elena's chest, releasing years of fear and uncertainty, like birds taking flight after being caged too long. Across the table, Sheriff Reed's eyes were bright with unshed tears, his hand tightening around theirs as if to anchor this moment in reality. "Then that's what we'll be," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him respected throughout the community, but now directed toward creating, rather than enforcing, a real family. Outside the window, Mrs. Henderson walked past with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, her gaze fixing on the domestic tableau with obvious calculation. But Elena found she no longer cared about the woman's opinions or the gossip that would surely follow. The truth was out, clean and bright as morning sunshine, and they would face whatever came together, unified by bonds that had been tested by years of separation and emerged stronger for the trial. The medallion caught the light as Thomas lifted his cup to drink, the silver star reflecting brightness that seemed to bless their small family with approval from forces greater than human judgment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them with the strength that came from finally understanding who they were to each other and the love that had brought them together despite impossible circumstances. 3 months later, Elena stood in the church vestibule wearing a dress the color of prairie wildflowers, the fabric flowing around her like captured sunlight as she prepared to walk down an aisle that represented more than marriage. It was the public claiming of a truth that had existed in private for years, the transformation of hidden connections into acknowledged bonds that could withstand community scrutiny. Thomas beside her in his best shirt, and the medallion shining at his throat like a badge of belonging. His small hand tucked into hers with the confidence of a child who had finally found his place in the world. Through the open doors, she could See the gathered congregation, some faces friendly and warm, others merely curious about the woman who had appeared from nowhere to claim the sheriff's heart, a few still sharp with judgment that had been softened but not eliminated by the passage of time and the obvious happiness of the man they respected. "You ready, Mama?" Thomas asked, using the title that had evolved to encompass both women who had loved him: Mary, who had given him life in a moment of desperate courage; Eleanor, who had given him everything else through years of devoted protection and care. "Are you?" she asked in return, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers that lingered over the familiar texture, marveling at how this simple gesture had become such a source of comfort and connection for both of them. He nodded solemnly, his grey eyes bright with excitement and something approaching joy. "Papa's waiting." Sheriff Reed stood at the altar, resplendent in his Sunday best, his grey eyes fixed on them with such love and certainty that Elena felt her last doubts dissolve like morning frost, touched by sunlight. Pastor Williams smiled benevolently beside him, the same man who had once questioned Thomas's background, now preparing to bless their union with the authority that made community acceptance official and binding. The transformation in the pastor's attitude had been one of many small victories that had marked their passage from secrecy to acknowledgement. When the truth had first emerged, there had been whispers and speculation, pointed questions about propriety and proper procedure. But Sheriff Reed's unwavering claim of his son, his obvious devotion to both Thomas and Eleanor, had gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the community. As they walked down the aisle together, Eleanor felt the weight of whispers and speculation, but also something stronger, the sense of rightness that had grown steadily since that first morning when she had knocked on the sheriff's door with hope and terror warring in her chest. Thomas walked between them, linking their hands as they approached the altar, creating a chain of connection that felt unbreakable, blessed by forces greater than human convention. The ceremony was simple, traditional words spoken with extraordinary meaning that transformed ordinary vows into something approaching poetry. When Sheriff Reed, Marcus, her husband now, kissed her, Thomas cheered with unrestrained joy that rang through the small church like music, and even the most disapproving faces in the congregation softened into smiles at the sight of such obvious happiness. After the service, they walked home through the prairie grass, Thomas running ahead to chase butterflies while Eleanor and Marcus followed hand in hand, their fingers intertwined with the natural ease of people who had found their proper place in the world. The house that had once seemed so empty now felt full of possibility, every room ready to hold the memories they would create together as a family united by choice as much as blood. The transformation of the house had been gradual but profound, Elena's touches gradually warming spaces that had been defined by solitude and careful control. Curtains now softened harsh lines, books and toys spoke of lives being lived rather than merely endured, and the kitchen had become a gathering place, where conversations and laughter created the kind of warmth that no fire could provide. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas curled between them with his head on Elena's lap and his feet resting against Marcus's leg in the casual intimacy of family love. The medallion at his throat caught the fading light, no longer a mystery, but a symbol of connections that had transcended time and circumstance to bring them together. "Tell me the story again," he said sleepily, the request that had become their evening ritual. "About the night I was born." Elena and Marcus exchanged a look over his head, understanding passing between them like light shared between mirrors. This would become their tradition, this telling and retelling of how love could triumph over loss, how truth could transform even the most difficult circumstances, how families could be created by choice as much as birth. "It was a night of storms," Elena began, her voice soft with memory and hope, weaving together the threads of past and present into a story that belonged to all of them. "But sometimes the most beautiful things are born from chaos." As she spoke, Marcus's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing, while above them the first stars appeared in the deepening sky like promises written in light. The medallion at Thomas's throat caught the starlight as his breathing deepened into sleep. The small silver star, a symbol of all the love that had brought them together, past and present, chosen and given, each thread woven into the tapestry of their unexpected family. In the distance, night birds called to one another across the prairie, their songs carrying on the wind like blessings, like the very sound of home made audible. The dust had settled on everything in Millbrook, but now it spoke not of grief, but of continuity, of lives lived and love shared, of the kind of peace that came from finally understanding where one belonged in the vast mystery of existence. The weight of hidden truths had been lifted, replaced by the lighter but no less significant weight of acknowledged love and chosen family. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her husband's breathing, her son's gentle sighs, and the prairie wind that had brought them all together in the fullness of time, carrying them home to each other, across impossible distances and through unimaginable circumstances.